Hello plant lovers, Matthew in Melbourne, Australia. Thank you very much for finding me, although today I wish I was in Melbourne, Florida because it is spring, but it is rainy, cold and miserable. But anyway, I grow cold, cool, intermediate orchids here in Melbourne without any greenhouses or grow lights or humidifiers. They're either inside or they're outside or they're out of the pool. So if that's of any interest, do hit subscribe. I post every week. And one of the things about Melbourne is our climate, which, as I grow a lot of orchids outside, is kind of an important part of the conversation. Australia doesn't have the same climatic zones as the US does. So it's quite hard to give a comparison as to what Melbourne's climate's really like. And it's actually hard for Melbourneites to explain what Melbourne's climate's like. But let's just say we have cold, wet winters that don't freeze, and we can have hot, dry summers that can also be wet and cold. Make of that what you will, but the not freezing in winter thing is the key. It means that a lot of orchids can survive quite happily outside. But, plant lovers, I'm here to tell you that this isn't one of them. Yes, it's time to introduce you to Miltoniopsis up Country Puna. And the story with this baby is the beginning of my orchid journey, plant lovers. I bought 3 Miltoniopsis. This one, another one called Kelly Spangled Banner, and this one, which we'll get to in a minute, which is called Field Leash. I bought them actually at a plant fair, which was great, and the grower there said, yes, I grow them outside under shelter, but they're outside all winter, but under cover, so protected from the rain and from extremes of temperature. Now, we all know that Miltoniopsis come from the northwest of South America, that corner up there, high altitude, quite damp forests. They're epiphytes, as most orchids are, and their Miltonia cousins are from the southeast of Brazil, so they like warmer, more humid environment. But Miltoniopsis really are cool to intermediate growing orchids. They're kind of like the same conditions that we do. But based on the intel from the guy who was selling them, who was clearly a grower, I thought, oh, okay, these orchids will quite happily survive outside all winter in my area that's undercover, so they're not being rained on. So these two, I decided in my infinite wisdom to winter outside last year. And Kelly Spangled Banner, which I've made many videos about, and she is here, I kept inside. And as you can see from Kelly Spangled Banner, what a vigorous, healthy looking plant, almost constantly in bloom, amazing fragrance. It's a real goer. But these plant lovers, last winter, so this was about 14-15 months ago, it's now early spring, and it was midwinter, we had a particularly cold night when the temperature went down to 1 degree Celsius, which is about 35-36 degrees Fahrenheit, almost freezing but not quite. The next morning I went out and my Miltoniopsis literally, and you can still see some of the damage, I had to cut the leaves off, but the leaves were literally brown. They had turned brown overnight with the cold. So I panicked, bought them inside and thought, oh, what have I done? Learned a valuable lesson that Miltoniopsis don't like temperatures that drop too much, and then just hoped for the best. And the best was that it's now 14-15 months later, and these two have just sulked. And I have gently nurtured them, so I've given them reasonable amounts of fertilizer, not too much, the kind of warmth, the kind of light, the kind of cool that they need, the right sort of watering, and they did slowly start to bounce back. And this one started to produce new growths, and although it's still quite a small plant, has produced this flower spike with 3 blooms, and I am extremely happy that it has come back from the brink of death and is flowering. Its cousin, Field Leash, is still sulking, but we'll get to him. So really, the moral of the story is, although Miltoniopsis need cool temperatures, they are not a cold tolerant orchid. So if you're in a climate like mine, you might just want to make sure that they're protected in those cold winter minimums. Anyway, I have learnt my lesson, and my Miltoniopsis now winter inside and they summer outside, because they also don't like extreme heat, and that can really affect them negatively and prevent them flowering and stress the plant. So they kind of really like the same bandwidth we do. So plant lovers, imagine my delight when I saw the flower spike on this and the flowers have opened. Now, the other Miltoniopsis that I have that blooms is Kelly Spangled Banner, which really opens out, and it's quite a multicolored bloom. If you have a look at the other video, you'll see it. But this one has a slightly different habit with the flower. So as you can see, it's really sort of more cup-shaped. And I was waiting, thinking, well, maybe those flowers are going to open. And they might do as they age. But this now has been open for well over a week. And I would have thought if the flowers are going to open more, they would have done. So that's interesting. It seems to have a slightly tighter cup to the flower. But my, oh my, isn't it stunning? So it's a very, very simple white flower, but look at the inside with these incredible golds, and it's not really red. Well, it is. It's a very dark, rich red, but I don't know. It's like a piece of embroidery or velvet in the middle. The flower is stunning. But the other thing is, there is a very gentle fragrance, and it's really light. It's a bit lily of the valley-like, but it's not strong. So my other Miltoniopsis, Curly Spangled Banner, has a really beautiful but much stronger fragrance. And if you have it on the table like I've got here, you would smell it if you were sitting around it. With this one, you've really got to get your nose in to smell, but nonetheless, it's beautiful. Lemon lily of the valley, I would say. Now the name, I always loved Miltoniopsis up Country Puna, because I just always assumed Puna was referring to Pune in India, which is actually spelt with an E, but it's pronounced Puna. Whereas in fact, it, I presume, is referring to Puna in Hawaii, which makes sense because so much orchid breeding and hybridization goes on in Hawaii. So I'm assuming that this is a Hawaiian name. And so just a quick rundown on basic care, even though I have done a Miltoniopsis video maybe once before, but they kind of have a special place in my heart because it was the first sort of non-typical orchid that I actually got to bloom. So I'm just really excited by it. And I'm so excited that this one has flowered. Anyway, let me calm my excitement and just talk about basic care. So to some degree, for me, I grow these largely indoors in winter, but also outdoors in summer, under cover. So pretty similar conditions to, let's say, an Oncidium. The only difference being, I think Oncidiums can take higher temperatures. Miltoniopsis really don't like that. So if you are in a really warm climate, you're going to need to find somewhere where they can be just a little bit cooler on the hottest parts of the summer. So generally indoors can work, and they're very happy indoors all the time if you've got that kind of climate. The only thing is though, they do need cool temperatures in winter. They need that temperature differentiation from season to season. So if you have amazing heating in winter, you might need to find somewhere cooler to put them in winter. But anyway, you'll figure it out, and I'm sure the orchid will tell you. And they do seem to have a bit of a bad reputation for being tricky, but I really don't find they do. Maybe it's the ambient temperature in Melbourne is kind of perfect for them because we are at a fairly moderate bandwidth here, but they seem to thrive in this climate. Water-wise, same as anything, except Miltoniopsis, I find, don't like to dry out as much as you could perhaps let an Oncidium dry out. So again, you don't keep the medium wet and damp, but don't let it dry out as much between waterings, and that then depends on the ambient temperature, the season, and what you've potted it in as to how often that will be. But I often just dribble a little bit of water, literally about the same amount as you'd put in tea of milk, every 3-4 days in warmer temperatures, and then really I just watch it in winter and decide how dry it is and how much it needs to be watered, but don't let them dry out. And you know that I'm a terracotta pot kind of guy. The only thing is, of course, that terracotta does evaporate water much faster. So in hot summer weather, you need to be on top of your watering. If you grow it in plastic, it will be a different story. It will retain more moisture, so you need to make sure you're not overwatering it. And the other thing I do with my Miltoniopsis is I do give them a mist with a water spray. Most mornings I walk around with a cup of tea saying hello, and I give everything a mist. But I find the humidity issue is really not a problem. I wouldn't say though that our interior is overly dry, but I do miss them because I just feel everyone loves a spritz in the morning and a cup of tea. And food-wise, because the hybrid Miltoniopsis can generally flower twice a year, I feed them twice a year. So in spring and in autumn, literally about 3 or 4 granules of a slow-release fertilizer in the top of the medium. And then during the warmer weather, when it's growing, I will give them maybe every 3rd watering, a watering with a diluted solution of an orchid feed. And that could be either an orchid-specific liquid feed, or it could be a bloom-specific feed, or it could just be a seaweed-based generic tonic. It depends what I'm feeling. And obviously if the plant is in spike. And I always dilute it by at least 1/8 because overfeeding plants can just cause no end of trouble. It's like binging on ice cream. A little often is not a bad idea, but too much in one go. And then the medium, as per most orchids, most epiphytic orchids that you're going to grow in the home, just a loose mix that is free draining, and mine is a mix of medium-sized bark with a bit of charcoal, with a bit of perlite, a little bit of shell grit, because the calcium in shell grit is useful to the orchids. When I pot them, I do put a few grains of that same generic slow release fertilizer in the mix, and mycorrhizal fungi. And that, as you might know, just assists in the healthy growth of roots for a plant, and what it does is it helps extract nutrients and makes them available to the roots of the plant so that the plant can flourish. So my healthy Miltoniopsis are really vigorous. Each pseudobulb will put out a growth, and the other interesting thing is that the growth does tend to come out rather than in a direction, such as with an Oncidium. So my other orchid, Kelly Spangled Banner, has kind of literally increased exponentially outwards from all angles with new growths going berserk. Whereas this one, obviously, it's still getting over its sulk. It's 15-month sulk, but I'm very happy that you have. But if anything, I may have actually over potted this slightly, but I'm going to leave it because it's now clearly in the groove of growth and flowering cycle, so it seems quite happy. But I think the best time to repot them, if you have to, is in spring, because you tend to get the new growths. But I've also repotted Miltoniopsis at any time. I just wouldn't do it if it's particularly warm, so not in midsummer. Okay, so this is the recovery success story. Shall we talk about the recovery? I'm not going to say failure, I'm just going to say it's a different story. So this one is Miltoniopsis Bert Field leash. Odd name. I wonder who Bert Field was. I should investigate. And why leash? And this, when it flowers, has an amazing monochrome flower, which is a beautiful pinky red, stunning, really bright color, which is why I loved the idea of this, the bright sort of red with Country Puna being white and Kelly Spangled Banner being multicolored. So I sort of have three versions of the Miltoniopsis bloom. So this one went through the same trauma last winter, and it was a much more vigorous plant. It was a bigger plant. And none of the pseudobulbs died, but they were severely affected by the cold. So I trimmed off all the dead leaves, which was quite a lot actually, and again, hoped for the best. And as we can see, 14, 15 months later, it has gotten over its sulk and it started to put out new growths, but it really should have flowered, I feel. Anyway, so I was looking at it in comparison to Country Puna, thinking to myself, it's just not really got its mojo on yet. And then again, looking at it, it might well be slightly over potted. So literally last week I thought, right, it's not doing anything. It's not got a flower spike. It's spring. It's the perfect time to repot it. I'm going to pot it down a size. But then, plant lovers, I was just looking in one of the new growths, and it's too small for me to try and show you, I think. But there is a little nudge coming out of one of the pseudobulb junctions where the leaf is. Now, that is where the flower spike emerges from the base, and it's actually easier to show you on Country Puna. So as you can see, the flower spike comes out from this junction of the pseudobulb and the outside leaf on whichever side. And the pseudobulbs will only bloom once. So again, like most orchids, you've got to promote vegetative growth to get new growths to mature in a 12-month cycle to then flower. Anyway, that's where you look for a flower spike. But that can also be where a new growth is going to emerge. And what I noticed in this, which now I can't find, there is a little shoot nudging out of that leaf joint. So I'm just going to wait. If it's a flower spike, I shall A, be extremely happy and fly the flags, and B, not repot it. But if it is a new growth coming out, then I will repot it. I will replace the medium and I will reduce the pot size, because as with lots of orchids, they do like to be a little snugger in the pot, and over potting things, although it seems counterintuitive, can often really inhibit growth, which I know sounds strange. You'd imagine it would just go crazy and its roots would fill the pot, but no. Orchids, particularly epiphytic ones, are kind of used to confined spaces and, you know, making the most out of the nook they've found. So pot it in the smallest pot the roots will take, and then allow it to need to be repotted on a natural cycle, which is probably every couple of years. There we are, plant lovers. Miltoniopsis rescue. Again, I've rescued another one which belonged to a friend, and I'll link that video as well. That was a COVID rescue. These are just being rescued from my own foolish stupidity and lack of knowledge. But plant lovers, I am, as I will say many, many times, a complete amateur. I feel that this was part of my Miltoniopsis learning curve, really understanding what their temperature requirements are, which is actually not difficult. It's the same bandwidth as me. So I should have really just figured that out sooner. But I'm really grateful that both of these didn't die and that they seem to be finally pinging back to life and flowering for me in this case. There we are. Thank you very much for watching. I hope that you have loved the recovery story of Country Puna as much as I have enjoyed seeing the blooms. I do post every week, so hit subscribe, and I look forward to seeing you next week with another adventure. See you then.